Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. Sometimes I wonder if it followed me home from Tongas National Forest. I'm Rachel Rogers, and I was 31 when we arrived at that cursed place in southeastern Alaska. And I'm not sure I ever really made it out. The massive Winnebago adventurer wound through the narrow Forest Service road, ancient Sitka spruces pressing close on both sides like cathedral pillars draped in moss. My husband, Marcus, gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, navigating the potholes and fallen branches that littered the path deeper into the Tongas. Our golden retriever, Bear, whined from his spot by the dinette, sensing something in the oppressive atmosphere that made his hackles rise. "Are you sure this is the right road?" Marcus asked, his voice tight with concentration. "We haven't seen another vehicle in 2 hours. I checked the GPS on my phone, though the signal had been spotty for the last 50 miles. According to the ranger, this should take us to the remote camping area near Salmon Creek. He said it was perfect for people who really want to get away from it all." "Well, we're definitely doing that," Marcus muttered, swerving to avoid a particularly deep rut. The ranger at the Ketchikan station had been helpful enough, marking our route on a paper map and warning us about the rough roads. What he hadn't mentioned was the feeling of being watched that started the moment we turned off the main highway, or the way the trees seemed to lean inward as we drove, as if the forest were slowly closing its jaws around us. "Look at the size of these trees," I breathed, pressing my face to the passenger window. Some of the Sitka spruces had to be over 200 feet tall, their trunks so massive that our RV could have driven through a hollow one without scraping the sides. Thick carpets of moss hung from every branch, creating a green twilight that filtered the afternoon sun into sickly shafts of light. Bear's whining grew more insistent, and he began pacing back and forth across the narrow aisle. I'd had him since he was a puppy, and I'd never seen him this agitated without cause. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked, reaching back to scratch behind his ears. His fur was standing on end, and when I touched him, he trembled. "Probably just excited about all the new smells," Marcus said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The road finally opened into a small clearing beside a rushing creek that must have been Salmon Creek. The ranger had been right about the isolation. We couldn't see any other campsites, any other people, any sign of human presence beyond the rutted road we'd traveled. Just towering trees, flowing water, and moss-covered boulders scattered like forgotten monuments. Marcus parked the RV in the center of the clearing and killed the engine. The sudden silence was profound. No traffic, no machinery, not even birdsong. Just the constant murmur of the creek and something else I couldn't quite identify. A subsonic humming that seemed to come from the forest itself. "It's beautiful," I said, and meant it. The isolation was exactly what we'd needed after Marcus lost his job at the accounting firm. The stress had been eating at both of us, and a week in the Alaskan wilderness felt like the perfect antidote to months of worry and financial strain. We spent the first hour setting up camp. Marcus extended the slide-outs and connected our portable solar panels while I organized our supplies and let Bear explore the immediate area. The dog stayed close to the RV, never venturing more than 20 feet away, constantly looking back at me as if seeking reassurance. "The cell service is completely dead," Marcus reported, holding his phone toward the sky. "Not even one bar." "Good," I said firmly. "That's exactly what we wanted. No work calls, no social media, no distractions. Just us and nature." But even as I said it, I felt a prickle of unease. The silence was too complete, too perfect. In all my years of camping, I'd never been in a forest so utterly devoid of animal sounds. No squirrels chattering in the trees, no birds calling to their mates, no insects buzzing through the air. It was as if every living creature except us had fled the area. That evening, we cooked dinner on the RV's outdoor grill while Bear lay at our feet, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. The shadows grew long and deep as the sun sank toward the horizon, though in the thick canopy, true darkness had arrived hours earlier. "Did you hear that?" Marcus asked suddenly. pausing with a forkful of salmon halfway to his mouth. I listened carefully. Hear what? I thought I heard singing, like a lullaby. I strained my ears but heard nothing beyond the creek's constant murmur. Probably just the water, but Bear had heard it too. His ears were pricked forward and he was staring intently into the forest where the shadows were deepest. A low growl rumbled in his throat. Not aggressive, but warning. "Easy, boy," I murmured, but my hand instinctively moved to rest on his head. As full darkness fell, we retreated inside the RV. Marcus tried to get the television working, but the satellite dish couldn't find a signal through the canopy. We settled for reading by LED light while Bear curled up on his bed by the door, though I noticed he kept lifting his head every few minutes, listening to sounds we couldn't hear. I was deep in my book when the tapping started. Tap, tap, tap. Soft, rhythmic, coming from somewhere outside the RV. "What is that?" I whispered. Marcus looked up from his magazine. "What's what?" The tapping stopped. "You didn't hear that? The tapping sound." He shook his head, but Bear was on his feet now, hackles raised, staring at the door with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "There," I said as the sound resumed. "Tell me you hear that." This time, Marcus nodded slowly. "Sounds like someone knocking on wood. Maybe a woodpecker?" At night, the tapping continued, moving around the perimeter of the RV in a slow circle. I tracked it by sound, starting at the front, moving along the driver's side, around the back, up the passenger side, and back to the front again. Always the same rhythm. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. Bear followed the sound too, his head turning as whatever was making the noise completed its circuit. When it reached the door again, he whined and backed away. "Should we look outside?" Marcus asked, though his tone suggested he didn't really want to. "Let's just ignore it," I said. "Probably just the RV settling or thermal expansion." But I knew it wasn't. The tapping was too deliberate, too consistent. Something was out there, circling our RV like a predator studying its prey. The sound continued for another hour before finally stopping. We went to bed in silence, both of us listening for any indication that it might resume. I lay awake long into the night. Bear pressed against my legs, both of us waiting for sounds that thankfully never came. I woke to silence. Not just quiet, the complete absence of sound that I'd noticed when we first arrived. Even the creek had stopped murmuring. I checked my watch. 3:33 a.m. Marcus was still sleeping beside me, his breathing deep and regular. I slipped out of bed and padded to the front window, careful not to wake him. The forest outside was wrong. Not obviously, not in any way I could immediately articulate, but something fundamental had changed during the night. The trees seemed taller, their branches lower, their shadows deeper, and in those shadows, I could swear I saw movement. Shapes that were almost human, but not quite, shifting between the massive trunks like smoke given form. Bear appeared beside me, pressing his warm body against my legs. He was trembling again, his eyes fixed on the same shadows that had caught my attention. "Do you see them too, boy?" I whispered. One of the shapes moved closer to the edge of the clearing, and for just a moment it stepped into the faint starlight that penetrated the canopy. I bit back a gasp. It was human-shaped, but wrong in every detail. Too tall, too thin, with arms that hung below its knees and a head that tilted at an unnatural angle. Its skin was pale as birch bark, and when it turned toward the RV, I saw that its eyes were black holes in a face that might once have been human. The thing stood at the forest's edge for several minutes, just watching our RV. Then it raised one impossibly long arm and began tapping against a tree trunk with the same rhythm I'd heard circling our camper earlier. Tap, tap, tap. Other shapes emerged from the shadows, all of them variations on the same disturbing theme. Some were taller, some shorter, but all shared that same elongated wrong quality. And all of them were staring at our RV with those hollow, hungry eyes. I wanted to wake Marcus, but I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but watch as more creatures emerged from the forest. Dozens of them, forming a wide circle around our clearing, all of them perfectly still except for the one that continued its rhythmic tapping. Bear whined softly. the sound barely audible but filled with a terror that matched my own. The creatures remained at the forest's edge until the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky. Then, as if responding to some signal I couldn't hear, they melted back into the shadows between the trees. Within moments, they were gone, leaving no trace of their presence except for the memory of those black, empty eyes. The sound of the creek resumed. "Did you sleep well?" Marcus asked when he woke an hour later. I almost told him about the creatures, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the way the morning light made everything seem normal again. Or maybe I was afraid he'd think I'd been dreaming. Instead, I just nodded and started making coffee. "Bear seems agitated," Marcus observed, watching our dog pace nervously around the small interior of the RV. "He's probably picking up scents from all the wildlife," I said, though I knew that wasn't true. If anything, the absence of normal forest animals was more pronounced than ever. We spent the day hiking along the creek, but Bear refused to venture more than a few feet from our sides. Every time we tried to encourage him to explore or chase a stick, he would look toward the forest with those same frightened eyes and slink back to heel position. "It's like he's scared of something," Marcus said, frowning as Bear cowered behind my legs when a branch fell somewhere in the distance. "Dogs have better senses than we do," I replied. "Maybe he's picking up on something we can't detect." But I was beginning to wonder if what Bear sensed was the same thing I'd seen during the night. The creatures watching from the shadows, waiting for something I couldn't begin to guess. That afternoon, while Marcus napped in the RV, I decided to explore the area around our campsite more thoroughly. Bear reluctantly followed, staying so close he kept stepping on my heels. I found the first carving about 50 yards from our RV. It was cut deep into the bark of a massive Sitka spruce, the wood still weeping sap as if the wound were fresh. But the carving itself looked ancient. A series of symbols that reminded me of Native American petroglyphs but followed no pattern I recognized. The second carving was on a tree 20 feet away. Then another and another. Soon, I realized that our entire campsite was surrounded by a ring of marked trees, each one bearing the same mysterious symbols. But it was the freshness of the cuts that disturbed me most. The sap was still flowing, the exposed wood still white and clean. These carvings had been made recently, possibly the night before while we slept and the creatures watched from the shadows. "Marcus," I called, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. I tried again, louder this time. "Marcus!" He emerged from the RV, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "What's wrong?" I showed him the carvings, leading him from tree to tree around the perimeter of our campsite. His expression grew more troubled with each marking we discovered. "These look fresh," he said, running his finger along one of the cuts, "like they were made with a very sharp knife." "Or claws," I added quietly. He shot me a sharp look. "What do you mean?" I told him about the creatures I'd seen during the night, the shapes moving in the shadows, the thing that had tapped against the tree. His face grew pale as I described their elongated limbs and hollow eyes. "You should have woken me," he said when I finished. I couldn't move. It was like they had some kind of hold over me, like I was paralyzed. Marcus examined the carvings more closely, using his phone's camera to document each symbol. "We should leave," he said finally. "Pack up and get out of here." "I agree," I said, relief flooding through me. "But let's wait until morning. I don't want to navigate that road in the dark." It was a decision I would regret for the rest of my life. That night, the creatures came closer. I saw them first through the bedroom window. Not at the forest's edge this time, but halfway across the clearing. The same impossibly tall, thin figures, but now I could see more details in the starlight. Their skin wasn't just pale. It was translucent, showing dark veins and organs beneath. Their faces were human enough to be recognizable but wrong in subtle ways, as if someone had tried to recreate human features from memory and gotten the proportions slightly off. And their eyes. Their eyes were worse than I'd initially thought. Not just black holes, but wells of darkness so deep they seemed to pull light into them, creating a void where eyes should have been. "Marcus," I whispered, shaking him awake. He sat up immediately, instantly alert. "What is it?" "They're back, and they're closer." He joined me at the window, and I heard his sharp intake of breath when he saw them. There had to be at least 20 of the creatures now, arranged in a loose circle around our RV. All of them perfectly still. All of them watching. Bear was pressed against the floor by the door, whimpering quietly. I'd never seen him so terrified, not even during thunderstorms or fireworks. "We're leaving," Marcus said, reaching for his clothes. "Right now." But when he tried to start the RV, nothing happened. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch, making the same futile grinding sound over and over. "Come on," he muttered, pumping the gas pedal. "Come on!" The creatures began to move, not quickly but with deliberate purpose, closing their circle around us. As they drew nearer, I could hear them making sounds. Not quite human speech, but a series of clicks and whispers that almost formed words. "The battery's fully charged," Marcus said, panic creeping into his voice. "There's no reason it shouldn't start." One of the creatures reached the RV and placed its impossibly long hand against the driver's side window. Its palm was easily twice the size of a human hand, with fingers that ended in what looked like claws. But it was the gentleness of the gesture that frightened me most. The way it pressed against the glass as if trying to communicate rather than break in. More creatures approached, surrounding the RV completely. They pressed their hands and faces against the windows, their breath fogging the glass from the outside. Their mouths moved constantly, forming words in that clicking, whispering language. "What do they want?" Marcus asked, his voice barely audible. I didn't answer because I was beginning to understand. The carvings around our campsite weren't random markings. They were a summoning circle, a way to call these creatures from whatever deep places in the forest they normally inhabited. And we were the offering. The tapping started again, but this time it came from all around us. Dozens of hands drumming against the RV's walls and windows in that same hypnotic rhythm. The sound was overwhelming, filling our heads until it was impossible to think of anything else. Bear had stopped whimpering and lay completely still. His eyes rolled back to show only white. I thought he might be dead until I saw the shallow rise and fall of his chest. "Rachel," Marcus said, and I turned to see him staring at the dinette window. "Look." One of the creatures had pressed its face against the glass so tightly that its features were distorted, flattened against the window like putty. But its eyes, those horrible, empty eyes, were fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth, and it spoke a single word in perfectly clear English. "Come." The voice was like wind through dead leaves, hollow and sibilant. It spoke again, and this time other voices joined it, creating a chorus that seemed to vibrate through the RV's walls. "Come to us. Come home." I felt something responding to that call, something deep inside me that wanted to obey. My hand moved toward the door handle without conscious thought, and only Marcus grabbing my wrist stopped me from opening it. "Rachel, what are you doing?" I blinked, suddenly aware that I'd been walking toward the door. I don't know. They were calling, and Don't listen to them," Marcus said urgently. "Whatever you do, don't listen." But it was becoming harder to ignore the voices. They were inside my head now, whispering promises of peace and belonging, of a place where I would never be alone or afraid again. All I had to do was open the door and step outside. The creatures pressed closer to the windows, their pale faces multiplying until every pane of glass showed the same horrible, hungry expressions. Their whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I felt my resistance crumbling. Marcus was saying something, but I couldn't hear him over the chorus of voices calling my name. The door handle was right there, just a few steps away. All I had to do was turn it, and this terrible waiting would be over. I was halfway to the door when Bear suddenly exploded into action. The dog launched himself at me, knocking me backward onto the dinette bench. The impact was enough to break whatever spell the creatures had woven around my mind, and I gasped as full awareness returned. "Thank you," I whispered to Bear, who stood protectively in front of me, his lips curled back in a snarl directed at the windows. The creatures had noticed my moment of resistance, and their whispers became angry, frustrated. They began pressing against the RV more forcefully, rocking it back and forth with their combined weight. "The roof," Marcus said suddenly. "They're not on the roof." I looked up at the skylight above the dinette and realized he was right. While the creatures surrounded us on all sides, none of them had climbed on top of the RV. "Can we get out that way?" I asked. "Maybe, if we can make it to the trees without them catching us." It was a desperate plan, but staying in the RV meant waiting for the creatures to either find a way in or for their whispers to overcome our resistance again, and I could already feel their voices pulling at the edges of my consciousness, trying to convince me to come outside. Marcos climbed onto the dinette table and carefully opened the skylight. Cool night air flowed in, carrying with it the scent of moss and decay. He pulled himself up and through the opening, then reached down to help me. "What about Bear?" I asked. "We'll figure something out. Come on." I climbed onto the table, but Bear jumped up beside me, whining anxiously. He was too big to fit through the skylight, and I couldn't bear the thought of leaving him behind. "I'm not going without him," I said. Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but another surge of angry whispers from the creatures below cut him short. "Fine, but hurry." I managed to squeeze through the skylight with Bear pressed against my chest, his claws scrambling for purchase on the RV's smooth roof. Marcus helped pull us both up, and we crouched on the roof, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The creatures below hadn't noticed our escape yet. They continued pressing against the windows and walls, their whispers rising and falling like an unholy hymn. But I knew it was only a matter of time before they realized we were gone. "The trees," Marcus whispered, pointing toward the nearest stand of spruces about 30 feet away. "We can make it if we run fast enough." I nodded, though every instinct screamed against leaving the relative safety of the RV's roof. Bear seemed to understand the plan and tensed his muscles in preparation for the sprint. "On 3, Marcus mouthed. 1, 2. We jumped. The creatures realized what was happening the moment our feet hit the ground. Their whispers turned to shrieks of rage, and they flowed around the RV like liquid shadow, racing to intercept us before we could reach the forest. Bear reached the trees first, disappearing into the darkness between the massive trunks. Marcus and I were right behind him, crashing through the undergrowth with no thought for stealth or direction. Behind us, the creatures howled their frustration, but they didn't follow us into the deep forest. We ran for what felt like hours, guided only by Bear's instincts and the faint starlight that occasionally penetrated the canopy. Branches tore at our clothes and faces, roots caught our feet, but we didn't stop until we could no longer hear the creatures' cries echoing through the trees behind us. Finally, exhausted and bleeding from dozens of small cuts, we collapsed beside a fallen log to catch our breath. "Which way is the road?" Marcus gasped. I looked around at the identical dark trunks surrounding us. "I have no idea." We were lost in the Tongas National Forest with no supplies, no shelter, and no way to call for help. But at least we were away from those things, those hungry creatures that had tried to lure us from our RV. Bear whined softly and pressed against my legs. When I looked down at him, I saw that his eyes were different. Not frightened anymore, but alert and purposeful. He began walking in a specific direction, pausing to look back at us as if asking us to follow. "He knows the way," I said, though I wasn't sure how that was possible. We followed Bear through the forest for the rest of the night, trusting his instincts when our own senses failed us. As dawn approached, I began to recognize landmarks. The distinctive shape of a moss-covered boulder, a tree with a peculiar split trunk. We were heading back toward the road we'd traveled the previous day. The sun was fully up when we finally stumbled out of the forest onto the graveled track that had brought us to this nightmare. Our RV was nowhere in sight, but Bear led us confidently along the road toward what I hoped was civilization. We walked for 6 hours before a park ranger in a green pickup truck found us. He was shocked to hear our story, or at least the edited version we told him. We'd gotten lost hiking and spent the night in the woods. We didn't mention the creatures or the carvings or the way they'd tried to call us from our RV. "You're Winnebago?" the ranger asked when we described our campsite. "We found it this morning, abandoned at the Salmon Creek site. Looked like someone left in a hurry." "Did you see anything else?" I asked carefully. "Any signs of unusual activity?" The ranger gave me a strange look. "Funny thing about that site. We've had 3 other groups abandon their camps there in the past month. All of them left their RVs behind, claimed they'd gotten spooked by something in the forest. What kind of something? Oh, you know how it is with city folks in the wilderness. Every shadow becomes a bear, every wind sound becomes a ghost. The Tongas can play tricks on people who aren't used to real isolation. But I could see in his eyes that he didn't quite believe his own explanation. Something was happening at that campsite. Something the Park Service either couldn't explain or didn't want to acknowledge. They gave us a ride back to our RV, which appeared exactly as we'd left it, except for one detail that made my blood run cold. Every window was covered with handprints, dozens of them pressed against the glass from the outside. Human-shaped but wrong in size and proportion, just like the creatures I'd seen. The ranger helped us hook up the RV and escorted us back to the main road, but I could tell he was relieved to see us go. We drove straight to Ketchikan without stopping, desperate to put distance between ourselves and whatever lived in those deep woods. It wasn't until we were on the ferry back to Seattle that I realized Bear was still different. Not frightened anymore, but watchful in a way he'd never been before. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at shadows with an intensity that suggested he was seeing things I couldn't. And sometimes, late at night when Marcus was asleep, I would hear Bear whining softly. When I'd check on him, he'd be staring out a window at the darkness beyond, his hackles raised as if he sensed something approaching. That was 6 months ago. We never went camping again, despite having invested thousands of dollars in our RV. Marcus sold it within a week of our return, claiming he wanted to try a different kind of vacation. But I knew the real reason. Neither of us could bear to sleep in a confined space after what we'd experienced in the Tongas. Bear never fully recovered from whatever he'd sensed in that forest. He became increasingly anxious as the weeks passed, refusing to go outside after dark and whimpering whenever we drove past wooded areas. The vet could find nothing wrong with him physically, but something in his mind had been permanently changed by our encounter with those creatures. 3 months ago, Bear disappeared. I'd let him out in our fenced backyard for his evening routine, but when I called him in, he was gone. The gate was still latched, the fence showed no signs of damage, but Bear was simply no longer there. We searched for weeks, posting flyers and checking every animal shelter in the city, but deep down, I knew we'd never find him. Whatever had called to us from the Tongas had finally claimed him, drawing him back to that cursed place where creatures with hollow eyes waited in the shadows between the trees. Marcus thinks I'm losing my mind, and maybe I am, but I know what I saw in that forest, and I know those things aren't finished with us yet. Sometimes when I'm alone in the house, I hear that familiar tapping sound, soft, rhythmic, coming from the walls. Tap, tap, tap. And sometimes, just at the edge of hearing, I catch fragments of those whispering voices calling my name, promising that if I just open the door and step outside, I can be reunited with Bear and finally come home to the place where I belong. I've been fighting the urge to listen to them, but it's getting harder every day. The whispers are growing stronger, more insistent, and I'm running out of strength to resist. If you're reading this, it means I've probably given in to their call. Don't look for me in the Tongas. You won't find anything there but more creatures waiting to add you to their collection. And whatever you do, don't go camping at Salmon Creek. Some places are hungry, and once they've tasted you, they never stop calling you home. They warned us. Locals always do. But we laughed. My name's David Jones. I had just turned 34 when we arrived at Goblin Valley, and it was the worst mistake of our lives. The red sandstone formations jutted from the desert like petrified sentries, their twisted shapes casting long shadows in the late afternoon sun. Sarah pulled our Winnebago into the designated RV camping area, the generator humming to life as we settled into what should have been a perfect weekend getaway. The kids, Emma, 12, and Jake, 9, pressed their faces against the windows, marveling at the alien landscape of southeastern Utah. "Look, Dad, that one looks like a dragon." Jake pointed at a particularly menacing hoodoo, its eroded features resembling a snarling mouth. "And that one's a castle," Emma added, her voice filled with the kind of wonder that made these family trips worthwhile. Sarah shut off the engine and stretched, her auburn hair catching the desert light. After 15 years of marriage, she still took my breath away. This place is incredible. I can't believe we've never been here before. I stepped outside, breathing in the dry air that tasted of sage and ancient stone. The silence was profound. No traffic, no city noise, just the whisper of wind through the rock formations. Our RV sat alone in the camping area, which struck me as odd for a Saturday in October. The weather was perfect, not too hot, not too cold. "Where is everyone?" Sarah asked, echoing my thoughts as she joined me outside. "Maybe we're early in the season," I suggested, though something felt off. The camping area looked maintained, the facilities clean and operational, but there were no other vehicles, no signs of recent occupation. We spent the first hour setting up camp, extending the awning, connecting the water and electrical hookups, arranging our outdoor chairs around a portable fire pit. The kids explored the immediate area, collecting interesting rocks and taking pictures with Emma's new camera. Everything felt normal, perfect even. As the sun began to set, painting the hoodoos in shades of orange and crimson, I noticed something strange. The formations seemed closer than they had been when we arrived. I mentioned it to Sarah as we prepared dinner on the RV's outdoor grill. "Rock formations don't move, honey," she laughed, but when she looked out at the landscape, her smile faltered slightly. "Though, they do look different in this light." The kids came running back as the first stars appeared, their voices echoing strangely among the stone pillars. "Dad, there's something weird about this place," Emma said, her usual composure cracked. When we were exploring, I kept hearing voices, but there was no one there. "Just echoes," I assured her, though I'd been hearing odd sounds myself. Whispers that seemed to come from the rocks themselves, carried on wind that barely stirred the dust at our feet. We ate dinner as darkness fell, the Coleman lanterns creating a warm circle of light around our campsite. The propane flames danced steadily, no wind to disturb them, yet I kept getting the feeling we were being watched. Every time I looked up from my plate, I expected to see eyes gleaming in the darkness beyond our little oasis of light. "Can we make s'mores?" Jake asked, and I was grateful for the normalcy of the request. We spent the next hour roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories, though I noticed none of us felt like telling particularly scary ones. The desert night felt ominous enough without our help. When it came time for bed, Sarah and I took the master bedroom at the back of the RV while the kids settled into the convertible dinette. The RV's generator provided power, but I'd planned to run it only when necessary to preserve fuel and maintain the peaceful atmosphere. "I love you," Sarah whispered as we lay in the dark, the small window above our bed revealing a tapestry of stars unlike anything we could see from our suburban home. "Love you too," I replied, pulling her close. Despite the odd feelings I'd had throughout the evening, lying there with her made everything seem right with the world. I woke to absolute silence. Not the peaceful quiet of the desert night, but something deeper, more complete. Even the constant hum of the RV's systems had stopped. I checked my phone, 3:17 a.m. The screen's glow seemed harsh in the profound darkness. Sarah was still sleeping beside me, her breathing soft and regular. I slipped out of bed and padded to the front of the RV to check on the kids. Emma and Jake were sound asleep, Emma clutching her stuffed rabbit, Jake sprawled across his converted bed with one arm hanging off the edge. I moved to the driver's seat and peered out through the windshield. What I saw made my blood freeze. The hoodoos had moved. Where before they had stood at a respectful distance from our camping area, now they formed a tight circle around our RV. The nearest formation, the one Jake had said looked like a dragon, was close enough that I could have reached out and touched it if not for the windshield. Its carved features seemed more defined in the starlight, the resemblance to a snarling face unmistakable. I rubbed my eyes, certain I was still half asleep, but when I looked again, the formations remained. Impossibly, they had moved during the night, repositioning themselves around us like pieces on a chessboard. My rational mind rejected what I was seeing. Rock formations that had stood for millions of years don't simply rearrange themselves overnight. I must be confused about our position, or maybe the darkness was playing tricks on my perception. But as I sat there in the driver's seat, staring out at the ring of stone sentries, I noticed something else that made my skin crawl. Each formation had what appeared to be a face, and every single one was turned toward our RV. Dozens of eroded, wind-carved visages, all focused on our little metal sanctuary. I tried to start the engine, thinking we should leave immediately, but nothing happened. The key turned, the dashboard lights flickered to life, but the motor remained silent. I tried again and again, pumping the gas pedal, though I knew it wouldn't help with the diesel engine. "Come on," I whispered, desperation creeping into my voice. "Daddy?" Jake's voice startled me. He was sitting up on his bed, hair tousled with sleep. "Why are we moving?" "We're not moving, buddy. Go back to sleep." But even as I said it, I felt it too. A subtle swaying motion, as if the RV were gently rocking. I looked out the side window and saw something that made my heart hammer against my ribs. The ground beneath us was moving, flowing like water, carrying us deeper into the maze of hoodoos. I shook Sarah awake, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Sarah, we need to get out of here. Something's wrong." She sat up, instantly alert. "What do you mean? What time is it?" "The rocks," I said, gesturing toward the windshield. "They've moved. We're surrounded." Sarah joined me at the front of the RV, her face pale in the dashboard light. That's not possible. Look outside. Look at where we are now." She pressed her face to the window and gasped. We were no longer in the camping area, but deep within the valley itself, surrounded by towering formations that blocked out most of the sky. The stone faces leered down at us, some 30 feet high, their empty eye sockets dark as pits. "The engine won't start," I told her, trying the key again. Still nothing. Emma woke up and immediately began crying. "I want to go home," she sobbed. "This place feels wrong." Sarah moved to comfort her while I continued my futile attempts to start the RV. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full. The battery indicator was green. All systems appeared normal, but the engine refused to turn over. "Maybe we should walk back to the road," Sarah suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. I looked out at the labyrinth of stone passages that surrounded us. "Do you remember which way we came?" In the darkness, every direction looked the same. The hoodoos formed a complex maze with no clear paths, no obvious exit. We could easily become lost within minutes of leaving the RV. "We'll wait until morning," I decided. "When the sun comes up, we'll be able to see better, figure out where we are." But morning never came. I watched the eastern horizon for hours, waiting for the first hint of dawn, but the sky remained a blanket of stars. My phone's clock showed 6:30 a.m., then 7 a.m., then 8 a.m., but the darkness never lifted. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, but the sun stubbornly refused to appear. Sarah made breakfast on the RV's stove, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for the kids. The propane worked fine, the water pump functioned normally, but the generator wouldn't start any more than the engine would. "It's probably just a solar eclipse or something," I told the kids, though I'd never heard of an eclipse lasting this long. "The sun will come up soon." But even as I said it, I was checking my phone's weather app, searching for any explanation. According to the data, sunrise should have occurred at 7:42 a.m. It was now past noon, according to my phone, yet the sky remained as dark as midnight. Emma had taken to sketching the rock formations around us, her artist's eye capturing details I'd missed. "Dad, look at this," she said, showing me her drawing of the dragon-faced hoodoo. "Do you see what I see?" In her sketch, the formation's features were even more pronounced than they appeared to the naked eye. What I'd taken for random erosion patterns clearly formed the image of a face. Not just any face, but something ancient and malevolent, with deep-set eyes and a mouth full of what looked like teeth. "It's just your imagination, sweetheart," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. The longer I stared at her drawing, the more unsettled I became. Jake had been unusually quiet, sitting by one of the windows and staring out at the stone formations. When I asked what he was thinking about, he said something that chilled me to the bone. "They're talking to each other," he said matter-of-factly. "Can't you hear them?" I listened, straining my ears, and gradually became aware of a sound I'd been subconsciously ignoring. A low vibration, almost below the threshold of hearing. like distant conversation carried on the wind. It seemed to come from the rocks themselves, a subsonic murmur that I felt in my chest as much as heard with my ears. "What are they saying?" I asked, humoring him. Jake looked at me with his 9-year-old's serious expression. "They're deciding what to do with us." Sarah shot me a warning look, clearly thinking I shouldn't encourage such talk, but I found myself believing him. The vibration continued, rising and falling in patterns that almost resembled speech, and I had the unsettling feeling that we were indeed the subject of some vast, slow conversation. By what should have been afternoon, though the darkness never lifted, I decided we had to try walking out. Staying in the RV felt increasingly like being trapped in a can while something decided whether or not to open it. I gathered our supplies: flashlights, water bottles, energy bars, a first aid kit. Sarah wanted to bring more, but I insisted we travel light. If we got lost in the maze, extra weight would only slow us down. "Stay close," I instructed the kids as we stepped outside. "Hold hands, and don't let go for any reason." The moment our feet touched the ground, I knew we'd made a mistake. The earth felt wrong, not solid like sandstone should be, but yielding, almost organic. It gave slightly under our weight, like walking on skin. The flashlight beams seemed weaker here, as if the darkness were actively absorbing the light. What should have illuminated 20 feet ahead barely reached 10, and the edges of our vision remained frustratingly black. We chose what appeared to be the widest passage leading away from our position and began walking. The stone walls rose on either side, their surfaces carved with the same facial features I'd been seeing in the individual hoodoos. Eyes, noses, mouths, all worn smooth by eons of wind and water, yet still recognizably human in their basic structure. Emma gasped and pointed upward. "Look!" High above us, barely visible in the beam of my flashlight, symbols had been carved into the rock face. Not random scratches, but deliberate marks that formed patterns I almost recognized but couldn't quite decipher. "Petroglyphs," Sarah said. "Ancient Native American rock art. But these didn't look like any petroglyphs I'd ever seen. The symbols seemed to move in the shifting light, rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. And there were far too many of them, covering every available surface like some obsessive documentation project. We walked for what felt like hours, the passage occasionally branching but always leading deeper into the maze. No matter which direction we chose, we never seemed to circle back toward the outside world. The walls grew higher, the passages narrower, until we were walking through corridors barely wide enough for two people side by side. Then Jake stopped suddenly. "Do you hear that?" We all listened. Behind us, echoing through the passages we'd just traversed, came the sound of footsteps. Not the measured pace of hikers, but something else. Irregular, shambling, as if whatever was following us didn't quite remember how to walk. "It's probably just our echo," I said, but I quickened our pace. The footsteps quickened too, maintaining their distance but never falling behind. Sometimes they seemed to come from ahead of us instead of behind, as if our pursuer were using passages we couldn't see to stay ahead of our position. Emma began to cry again, quietly, trying not to make noise. Sarah pulled her close while I swept the flashlight beam across the walls around us, looking for any opening we might have missed. That's when I saw them. Faces emerging from the stone itself. Not carved, not eroded by natural forces, but actual human faces pushing through the rock as if it were water. Eyes blinking, mouths opening and closing silently, expressions of pain or terror or something worse. "Sarah," I whispered, "look at the walls." She followed my gaze and stifled a scream. The faces were everywhere now, dozens of them, all different but sharing the same expression of desperate hunger. Men, women, children, all trapped in the stone, all reaching toward us with their eyes. The footsteps behind us grew louder, closer, and I realized we had no choice but to keep moving forward. Whatever was following us was less appealing than the faces in the walls, at least for now. We ran. The passage twisted and turned, branching into smaller corridors that branched again into even smaller ones. The walls pressed closer, the ceiling lower, until we were forced to crawl single file through spaces barely large enough to accommodate our bodies. Behind us, the footsteps had become something else, a wet, sliding sound, as if our pursuer had abandoned the pretense of walking and was now flowing through the passages like liquid. "Emma!" screamed. I turned to see her pointing at one of the faces embedded in the wall beside her. It had opened its mouth and was speaking, though no sound came out. But I could read its lips, and the words chilled me more than anything we'd encountered so far. "Help us," the face was saying. "Please help us." All around us, the other faces had begun to move, their lips forming the same silent plea. Hundreds of trapped souls, all begging for rescue, all reaching out with stone fingers that could never quite break free from their rocky prison. The sliding sound behind us grew louder, and I caught a glimpse of what was following us in the reflected beam of my flashlight. It might have been human once, but whatever it was now defied description. It moved like oil, flowing over and around obstacles, but occasionally formed shapes that suggested arms, legs, a head. Most disturbing of all, it seemed to be trying to speak, its mouth-like opening forming words in a voice like grinding stone. "Come back," it whispered. "Come back to us." We crawled faster, scraping our knees and elbows on the rough stone, until finally the passage opened into a small chamber. We tumbled out, gasping and bleeding, and I immediately began searching for another exit. There was none. We were trapped in a circular room about 10 feet across with walls that stretched up beyond the reach of our flashlight beams. The faces were here too, emerging from every surface, all silently pleading for help we couldn't provide. Sarah pulled the kids close while I examined the walls, desperately searching for any crack or crevice that might offer escape. But the stone was smooth, seamless, perfect in its construction. "David," Sarah whispered, and I turned to see her pointing at something behind me. Words were appearing on the wall, carved by invisible hands in deep, precise letters. "Welcome to the collection." Below that, more words formed. "You will make fine additions." I pressed my back against the wall, trying to shield the kids from whatever was writing the messages. The stone felt warm against my shoulders, and I realized it was moving, flowing like clay being shaped by unseen fingers. "Daddy," Jake said in a small voice, "I think I know what happened to us." "What do you mean?" "We drove into a trap. This whole place is alive, and it collects people, like specimens." As if in response to his words, the walls began to close in. Not quickly, but with inexorable purpose, reducing the size of our prison by inches every minute. The faces embedded in the stone seemed to nod in sympathy, their expressions saying, "Yes, this is how it happened to us too." Sarah grabbed my hand. "I love you," she said. "Whatever happens, I love you and the kids more than anything." "I love you too," I replied, and meant it with every fiber of my being. But even as I spoke the words, I felt the stone beginning to embrace me. Not painfully, but gently, like sinking into warm water. My feet were already partially merged with the floor, and I could feel the rock slowly working its way up my legs. Emma and Jake were crying, but not in panic, in a strange kind of acceptance, as if they understood that resistance was futile. They were becoming part of the wall, their young faces already beginning to show the smooth, worn appearance of the other trapped souls. Sarah's hand slipped from mine as she too became one with the stone. Her eyes remained clear and aware, but her mouth was sealed shut, her body immobilized for eternity. I fought it as long as I could, but eventually I felt my own consciousness beginning to fade as the rock consumed me. My last coherent thought was a mixture of terror and strange peace. We would be together forever, preserved in this place, part of something vast and ancient and hungry. But we would never truly be alive again. I don't know how long I existed as part of the wall before I became aware again. Time has no meaning when you're embedded in stone, when your only companions are the other faces that emerge from the rock to share their silent stories of how they came to be trapped. Some had been hikers like us. Others were hunters, rock climbers, even a few park rangers who had come looking for missing persons and become missing themselves. All of us collected by the thing that lived in Goblin Valley, the entity that wore the landscape like a skin and lured travelers into its embrace. But something changed. I began to notice that some of the newer faces were different, their expressions not resigned but determined. They whispered to each other when the entity wasn't paying attention, sharing information, planning something. And slowly, over what might have been years or decades, I learned the truth. The entity wasn't invincible. It was old, ancient beyond human comprehension, but it was also lonely. It collected people not just to feed on their life force, but to have companions, to create a community of trapped souls that could keep it company through the eons. But its hunger was also its weakness. Every person it absorbed made it slightly less coherent, more scattered, harder for it to maintain the illusion of the normal world. And if enough people could coordinate their efforts, if enough trapped souls could act in unison. The plan took generations to develop, with new prisoners adding their knowledge to the collective effort. Engineers figured out the entity's structural weaknesses. Scientists theorized about its biological nature. Survivors shared stories of near escapes, close calls, moments when the trap had almost failed. And finally, we were ready. It started with the children. They were always the strongest, their spirits not yet worn down by decades of imprisonment. Jake and Emma, still trapped but not broken, began to sing. Not with their voices, which had been taken from them, but with their minds, projecting a sound that resonated at just the right frequency to disrupt the entity's control. Other children joined them, then adults, until dozens of voices combined in a silent harmony that made the very rocks shake. The entity tried to stop us, but it couldn't silence us all at once, and every voice that joined the chorus made the others stronger. The walls began to crack. Not physically, but something deeper. The psychic bonds that held us prisoners started to weaken. I felt movement in my stone limbs for the first time in years. Felt my face begin to push forward from the wall that had held it. Some of us made it out, not all. The entity fought back, crushing some of the escapees back into the stone, sealing others so deep they might never surface again. But enough of us broke free to weaken its hold on the rest. I found myself standing in the chamber where we'd been trapped, my family beside me, all of us gasping as if we'd been holding our breath for years. The walls still showed the impressions of faces, but they were fading, becoming ordinary rock once again. We ran, through passages that shifted and changed as the entity's control weakened, past walls that screamed in voices we recognized, toward light that flickered and wavered but grew stronger with each step. And finally, impossibly, we burst out of the maze and found ourselves standing beside our RV in the camping area of Goblin Valley State Park. The sun was rising, the real sun, not the false dawn we'd glimpsed in our prison, and the hoodoos stood in their proper places, distant and harmless in the morning light. The RV started on the first try. We drove home in silence, none of us quite believing we'd escaped, all of us knowing that others hadn't been so fortunate. The radio played normal songs, the GPS showed normal roads, but we could still feel the entity's hunger reaching out across the miles, still hear the silent chorus of those we'd left behind. I never reported what happened to us. Who would believe such a story? Instead, I researched everything I could find about Goblin Valley, about unexplained disappearances in Utah's desert parks, about ancient things that might have survived from before human civilization. I found more than I wanted to. Stories from Native American tribes about places that should not be visited, about spirits that wore the shapes of familiar landscapes. Reports from park rangers about hikers who vanished without a trace, their vehicles found abandoned at trailheads with no sign of struggle. Geological surveys that showed anomalies in certain areas, places where the rock formation seemed to change configuration between satellite photos. The entity wasn't unique to Goblin Valley. It was one of many, scattered across the remote places of the world, ancient beyond measure and patient as stone. They fed on travelers, on people drawn to lonely places by the promise of natural beauty and solitude. And they were always hungry. Sarah and I never spoke about what happened to us, not directly. But sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep, she would take my hand and whisper, "We made it out." as if she needed to reassure herself that we were really free. The kids were different afterward. Emma stopped drawing altogether, claiming her hands shook too much to hold a pencil steady. Jake developed a fear of enclosed spaces that required months of therapy to overcome, but they were alive and whole, and that was more than many could say. I still dream about the faces in the walls sometimes. They call to me, begging me to come back, to help them escape as we had escaped. And sometimes in my darkest moments, I consider it. I know the way now, know how to find the passages that lead back to the collection chamber. But I also know that going back would mean joining them permanently. The entity only allows one escape per family, one taste of freedom to make the final imprisonment all the more bitter. So I content myself with telling this story, hoping that someone might read it and choose a different destination for their next camping trip, hoping that someone might recognize the signs and turn back before it's too late, because the entity is still there, still hungry, still adding to its collection. And somewhere in the stone walls of that ancient prison, faces are pushing through the rock, silently pleading for help that may never come. Stay away from Goblin Valley, and if you must go, don't trust the darkness. Don't trust the silence. And whatever you do, don't let the rocks surround you. Some traps are older than human memory, and infinitely more patient than human hope. We should have never gone to Big Bend. I'm Michael Williams. I was 28 back then. And this is the story of how I lost everything. The Fleetwood bounder rumbled down the desert highway, heat waves shimmering off the asphalt like liquid mercury. My wife, Jennifer, sat in the passenger seat, her blonde hair whipping in the dry wind from the open window, while our German shepherd, Duke, panted heavily from his spot on the dinette cushions. The GPS showed we were still 40 miles from Big Bend National Park, but civilization had already vanished behind us, swallowed by the endless expanse of the Chihuahuan Desert. "Look at this place," Jennifer breathed, gesturing at the stark landscape rolling past. "It's like another planet." She was right. The terrain was alien in its harshness, jagged mountains thrust up from the desert floor like broken teeth, their peaks lost in the brutal afternoon sun. Scattered creosote bushes and prickly pear cacti dotted the hardpan between towering mesas, creating patterns that hurt the eyes to follow for too long. The ranger said to watch for the turnoff to Devil's Backbone Ridge, I said, consulting the handwritten directions we'd received at the Alpine Visitor Center. "Supposed to be some of the best boondocking in the park." Duke whined and shifted restlessly, his dark eyes fixed on something outside that I couldn't see. He'd been agitated since we left the main road an hour ago, his usual calm demeanor replaced by nervous energy that made the hair on my arms stand up. "What's wrong with him?" Jennifer asked, reaching back to stroke Duke's head. "He's been acting weird all day." "Probably just the heat," I replied, though the RV's air conditioning was running full blast. Dogs don't handle desert temperatures very well, but I knew it was more than that. Duke was a military dog before I adopted him, trained to detect threats that humans missed, conditioned to trust his instincts above all else, and right now, every instinct he had was screaming danger. The turnoff appeared exactly where the ranger had said it would, a barely visible dirt track winding between two massive boulders. A weathered sign read, "Devil's Backbone Primitive Camping, 4WD recommended, no services." "You sure about this?" Jennifer asked as I turned onto the rough track. "That road doesn't look like it was made for RVs." "The ranger said it was passable with care," I said, downshifting as the bounder began climbing a steep grade. "And we've got the clearance for it." The road wound upward through increasingly rugged terrain, switchbacking between towering red rock formations that blocked out most of the sky. I had to crawl along at 5 miles per hour, carefully navigating around boulders and washouts that could have disabled us permanently. Duke's whining grew more insistent as we climbed, and he began pacing back and forth across the narrow aisle. I'd never seen him this agitated, not even during thunderstorms or fireworks. "Maybe we should turn back," Jennifer suggested, but even as she spoke, we crested a ridge and saw our destination spread out below us. Devil's Backbone Ridge was a narrow plateau about the size of a football field, surrounded on 3 sides by sheer cliffs that dropped away into purple shadows. A single flat area near the center provided space for camping, while the ridge's spine, a jagged line of red rock that did indeed resemble vertebrae, ran along the eastern edge. "Wow," Jennifer whispered. "It's incredible." The view was breathtaking. We could see for 100 miles in every direction, wave after wave of desert mountains stretching to the horizon, painted in shades of red and gold by the setting sun. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the rocks and the distant cry of a hawk circling somewhere below us. I parked the RV in the center of the flat area and killed the engine. The sudden quiet was almost oppressive after hours of road noise and air conditioning. Duke immediately moved to the door, whining to be let out, but when I opened it, he refused to leave the RV. "Come on, boy," I coaxed, but he just backed away from the door, his ears flattened against his head. "He probably smells something," Jennifer said. "Coyotes or javelinas or something." But when I scanned the ridge, I saw no sign of wildlife. No birds, no insects, no movement of any kind. The place felt sterile, empty of life in a way that went beyond the normal harshness of the desert. We spent the first hour setting up camp, extending the slide-outs, deploying our solar panels, and arranging our outdoor furniture to take advantage of the spectacular view. Duke eventually ventured outside but stayed within a few feet of the RV, constantly looking around as if expecting an attack. "Look at these," Jennifer called from near the ridge's spine. She was examining what appeared to be petroglyphs carved into the red rock, spirals and animal figures and symbols I didn't recognize. "The ranger mentioned those," I said, joining her. "Supposed to be 1,000-year-old Native American rock art. But as I studied the carvings more closely, something bothered me. The symbols looked wrong somehow. Too angular and aggressive for the flowing style I associated with ancient petroglyphs. And they were deep, carved into the rock with a force that suggested desperation rather than artistic expression. "This one looks like a warning," Jennifer said, pointing to a series of symbols that seemed to show figures fleeing from something with too many teeth. Duke approached the carvings but stopped several feet away, his hackles rising. He stared at the symbols for a long moment, then backed away, whimpering. "Even he doesn't like them," Jennifer observed. "Maybe we should set up camp somewhere else on the ridge." But the flat area where we'd parked was the only space large enough for the RV. Everywhere else, the plateau was broken by rocks and crevices that would make camping impossible. As the sun set, painting the desert in shades of fire and blood, we cooked dinner on our portable grill. The temperature dropped rapidly once the sun disappeared, and we were grateful for the RV's heating system. Duke refused to eat, instead positioning himself by the door like a sentry. "I've never seen him act like this," I said, watching our dog's vigilant posture. "It's like he's guarding against something." "Maybe we're just too isolated," Jennifer suggested. "He's probably picking up on our own nervousness." But I wasn't nervous, at least not until Duke started acting strange. The ridge was beautiful, peaceful, exactly the kind of remote wilderness experience we'd been seeking. So why did I feel like we were being watched? The feeling intensified as true darkness fell. There were no lights for 100 miles in any direction, making the stars brilliant beyond anything we could see from our suburban home. But that same darkness felt oppressive, pregnant with hidden threats. Duke began growling around 10 o'clock, a low, continuous rumble that seemed to vibrate through the RV's floor. When I looked out the window to see what had triggered his alarm, I saw nothing but empty desert bathed in starlight. "What is it, boy?" I asked, but Duke just continued staring out into the darkness, his body rigid with tension. Jennifer tried to coax him away from the window, but he wouldn't budge. "He's really spooked," she said. "Maybe we should bring him inside for the night." "He is inside," I pointed out. "I mean inside, in the bedroom with us." It was a reasonable suggestion, but when we tried to move Duke away from his post by the door, he became agitated, whining and pawing at the floor. He clearly believed his vigil was necessary. We went to bed with Duke still on guard duty, his low growls providing a disturbing soundtrack to our attempts at sleep. I lay awake for hours, listening to the night sounds of the desert, the distant howl of coyotes, the whisper of wind through stone, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Tapping. Soft, rhythmic, coming from somewhere outside the RV. At first I thought it was a loose panel vibrating in the wind, but the sound was too regular, too deliberate. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, tap. Duke's growling intensified, and I heard him moving around in the main compartment. I slipped out of bed and padded to the bedroom door, peering through the crack. Our dog was pressed against the entry door, his entire body tense with alertness. The tapping sound was clearer here, definitely coming from outside and definitely not random. It had the quality of communication, like someone knocking in code. The sound moved around the perimeter of the RV, starting at the front and working its way toward the back. I followed its progress through the walls, each tap seeming louder than the last. "Michael?" Jennifer's voice was barely a whisper. "Do you hear that?" "Yeah," I replied, my own voice tight with tension. "Someone's out there." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't someone. The spacing of the taps was wrong, the rhythm too alien for human communication. And there was something else, a quality to the sound that suggested the tapper wasn't using knuckles or tools, but something harder, sharper. The tapping completed its circuit and stopped. Duke continued growling for several more minutes before finally settling down, though he remained alert and watchful. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Dawn came slowly to Devil's Backbone Ridge, the eastern horizon gradually lightening from black to deep purple to rose gold. I made coffee while Jennifer slept, grateful for the normalcy of familiar routines. Duke had finally relaxed with the coming of daylight, even venturing outside to relieve himself and explore the immediate area around the RV, but he stayed close, never wandering more than 20 feet from our campsite. "Sleep well?" Jennifer asked when she emerged from the bedroom, though her rumpled appearance suggested she'd been awake for much of the night too. "You heard it too, didn't you?" I said. "The tapping." She nodded, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug for warmth. "What do you think it was?" "Probably just thermal expansion," I said, though I didn't believe it. Desert temperatures swing pretty dramatically at night. But when I went outside to check for loose panels or other mechanical issues, I found something that made my blood run cold. Tracks. Not human tracks, but not animal either. They circled our RV in a perfect ring, each print showing what appeared to be long, clawed digits pressed deep into the hard desert soil. Whatever had made them was bipedal, but definitely not human. The prints were too long, too narrow, with claw marks extending several inches beyond each toe. "Jennifer," I called, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Come look at this." She joined me outside, her face paling when she saw the tracks. "What kind of animal makes prints like that?" "I don't know," I admitted, "but we're getting out of here." Duke was already at the RV door, whining to be let inside. Whatever had visited us during the night, he wanted no part of a second encounter. We broke camp quickly, securing everything inside the RV and preparing to navigate the treacherous road back down to the main highway. I was backing away from our camping spot when Jennifer screamed. "Stop! Look!" I slammed on the brakes and followed her pointing finger. At the edge of the ridge, silhouetted against the morning sky, stood a figure that shouldn't exist. It was humanoid, but wrong in every detail. 8 feet tall and impossibly thin, with arms that hung below its knees and a head that seemed too large for its elongated neck. Its skin was dark as shadow, and when it turned toward us, I saw that its face was a nightmare of sharp angles and gleaming teeth. The creature watched us for several long seconds, then raised one impossibly long arm and began tapping against a nearby boulder with the same rhythm I'd heard during the night. Tap, tap, tap. Duke went absolutely berserk, barking and snarling with a fury I'd never seen from him. The creature's head tilted at an unnatural angle, studying our dog with what might have been curiosity. Then it smiled. The expression was worse than any snarl or grimace could have been, a wide, knowing grin that revealed rows of needle-sharp teeth. It raised its other arm and beckoned to us, the gesture somehow both inviting and threatening. "Drive," Jennifer whispered. "Drive now." I floored the accelerator, and the bounder lurched forward toward the narrow track that led down from the ridge. In the side mirror, I could see the creature still standing at the edge of the plateau, its arms still raised in that horrible beckoning gesture. The descent was a nightmare of switchbacks and near misses, the RV's suspension groaning as we bounced over rocks and through washouts. I took chances I never would have attempted under normal circumstances, driven by the desperate need to put distance between us and whatever we'd encountered on the ridge. Duke continued barking for the first 10 minutes of our descent, his attention focused on the windows facing back toward Devil's Backbone. Then, suddenly, he fell silent and pressed himself against the floor, whimpering. "What's wrong with him now?" Jennifer asked. I glanced in the mirror and nearly drove off the road. The creature was following us, not running or walking, but flowing down the rocky slope like liquid shadow, somehow keeping pace with our 20-mile-per-hour descent despite the impossible terrain. It moved without regard for gravity or physics, occasionally visible on the cliff faces beside us, sometimes appearing on the road behind us, always maintaining that same horrible grin. "It's following us," I said, my voice cracking with fear. Jennifer turned to look and let out a strangled gasp. "How is it doing that?" The creature seemed to hear her voice through the RV's walls. It raised its head and looked directly at us through the rear window, its eyes glowing like coals in its shadow-dark face. Then it spoke. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, seeming to vibrate through the RV's structure rather than traveling through air. It spoke in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow I understood its meaning perfectly. "You cannot leave. This is our place. You are ours now." I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing the RV beyond safe speeds for the treacherous road. The creature flowed alongside us, sometimes running on two legs, sometimes dropping to all fours, occasionally seeming to fly between the rocks with impossible grace. "The highway," Jennifer said, pointing ahead. "If we can just reach the highway." But I could see that we weren't going to make it. The creature was getting closer, and with each passing minute it seemed more solid, more real. What had started as a shadow-thin figure was gaining substance, developing details that made my sanity recoil. Its claws were easily 6 inches long, curved like scythe blades. Its teeth weren't just sharp, but serrated, designed for tearing rather than biting. And its eyes. Its eyes held an intelligence that was ancient and utterly alien, predatory in a way that went beyond simple hunger. We reached the junction with the main highway, and I took the turn without slowing down, the RV's tires screaming against the asphalt. For a moment, I thought we'd escaped. The creature hesitated at the road's edge as if something prevented it from leaving the desert. Then it stepped onto the highway and began following us down the center line. Cars were approaching from both directions, but they seemed oblivious to the 8-foot nightmare loping down the road. A pickup truck passed right through the creature without slowing, as if it weren't there. "They can't see it," Jennifer whispered. "Why can't they see it?" I had no answer. The creature was clearly visible to us, solid enough to leave tracks, but apparently invisible to everyone else. It continued pursuing us down the highway, its grin never wavering, its pace never slowing. Duke had fallen completely silent, pressing himself against the floor in a display of terror that broke my heart. My brave, loyal dog, who had faced enemy fire in Afghanistan without flinching, was reduced to a quivering mass of fear by whatever was chasing us. Miles passed, and still the creature followed. It never tired, never faltered, maintaining its steady pursuit with mechanical persistence. Other vehicles passed through it as if it were smoke, but I could see it clearly in my mirrors. Always there, always grinning, always just a few steps behind. "We have to stop," Jennifer said suddenly. "We're almost out of gas, and Duke needs water." She was right. We'd been driving for 2 hours, and the fuel gauge was approaching empty. The next town was still 50 miles away, and Duke was panting heavily in the desert heat. I pulled into a truck stop outside of Marathon, Texas, keeping one eye on the mirrors as I backed up to the gas pumps. The creature stopped at the edge of the parking lot, its head tilted as it studied the building and the people moving around it. "It won't come closer," I observed. "Something about this place is keeping it back." We filled up with gas and gave Duke water and food, all while keeping watch on our pursuer. It remained at the lot's perimeter, sometimes pacing back and forth, sometimes standing perfectly still with that horrible grin never leaving its face. An old man pumping gas at the next island noticed my constant glances toward the desert. "You folks okay?" he asked. "You look spooked." "Did you see—" I started, then stopped. If other people couldn't see the creature, telling them about it would only make us sound insane. "See what?" the man prompted. "Nothing," I said. "Just thought I saw something out there." The man followed my gaze toward the edge of the lot, and for a moment, his expression changed. "You been up to Devil's Backbone?" he asked quietly. My blood chilled. "How did you know?" "Because that's where they come from," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The shadow folk. Most people can't see 'em, but some can. And once they've marked you—" He shook his head sadly. "What do you mean, marked us?" "You spent the night up there, didn't you? On the ridge?" I nodded. "Then you're theirs now. They don't let go once they've claimed someone." Jennifer had joined us. Duke pressed against her legs. "Is there anything we can do?" she asked. The old man studied the creature at the lot's edge, then shook his head. "Maybe, but it ain't easy. And it ain't safe." He told us about a place called Bruha Canyon, about 30 miles south of our current position. According to local legend, it was sacred ground, a place where the normal rules didn't apply, where creatures like our pursuer couldn't follow. "But the canyon's dangerous," he warned. "People go in there and don't come out. Might be you'd just be trading one kind of death for another." As if responding to our conversation, the creature at the lot's edge began moving closer. Not rapidly, but with steady determination, its grin widening with each step. "It's coming," Jennifer said, backing toward the RV. The old man glanced at the approaching figure. Apparently he could see it too, and nodded grimly. "Better decide quick. Bruha Canyon's your only chance, but like I said, the creature was halfway across the parking lot now, its shadow falling across other vehicles despite the bright sunlight. A family getting out of a minivan passed right through it, completely unaware of the nightmare in their midst. We'll take our chances with the canyon, I decided. The old man gave us directions, warned us one final time about the dangers, then climbed into his truck and drove away without looking back. Smart man. We loaded Duke into the RV and pulled out of the truck stop, the creature immediately resuming its pursuit. But something had changed in its demeanor. The casual confidence was gone, replaced by something that might have been urgency. Bruha Canyon was exactly where the old man had said it would be. A narrow cut in the desert mountains marked by a weathered wooden sign in Spanish and English. Danger, unstable rock. Enter at your own risk. The dirt road leading into the canyon was even rougher than the track to Devil's Backbone, barely wide enough for the RV and littered with rocks that scraped against our undercarriage. But the creature following us had stopped at the canyon's mouth, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "It's not following," Jennifer observed. The old man was right. We drove deeper into the canyon, the walls rising on either side until they blocked out most of the sky. The rock here was different from Devil's Backbone. Darker, older, carved with symbols that made my eyes water to look at directly. After about a mile, the road opened into a circular clearing surrounded by towering cliff walls. A natural spring bubbled up from the center, creating a small oasis of green vegetation in the otherwise barren landscape. "This is it," I said, parking the RV near the spring. "Our sanctuary." Duke immediately perked up, his terror replaced by curiosity. He jumped out of the RV and began exploring the clearing, his tail wagging for the first time since we'd left Devil's Backbone. "He likes it here," Jennifer said, relief evident in her voice. We set up camp by the spring, grateful for the fresh water and the sense of safety provided by the canyon walls. For the first time in 18 hours, I felt like we could breathe again, but our relief was premature. As night fell, I began to notice that the symbols carved into the canyon walls were glowing. Not brightly, but with a subtle phosphorescence that gradually became visible as darkness deepened. And with the glow came sounds, whispers in languages I couldn't identify. Chanting that seemed to come from the rocks themselves. Duke's brief return to normalcy evaporated. He pressed against our legs, whimpering as the whispers grew louder and more insistent. "This place isn't safe either," Jennifer said, her voice tight with renewed fear. "Whatever's here, might be worse than what was following us. The whispers resolved into words. Not English, but somehow comprehensible. Welcome, travelers. Welcome to the place between worlds. Figures began emerging from the canyon walls. Not solid like the creature that had pursued us, but translucent, ghostly. They appeared to be human, but their clothes and appearance suggested they were from different time periods. Spanish conquistadors, Native American warriors, modern hikers, all united by the same expression of desperate hunger. The canyon collects people, I realized, just like Devil's Backbone, but different. These aren't creatures, they're the souls of everyone who ever took refuge here. The ghostly figures drifted closer, their whispers becoming more urgent. Stay with us. Join us. You're safe here. You're home here. Forever here. I understood then why the old man had warned us. Bruha Canyon wasn't a sanctuary. It was another trap, a place where people fleeing one supernatural threat became victims of another. But at least these spirits had once been human. Unlike the shadow creature from Devil's Backbone, they might be reasoned with. We don't want to stay, I called out to the gathering specters. We just need protection from what's following us. The ghostly figures paused their approach, their whispers falling silent. Then one of them, a woman in modern hiking gear who couldn't have been dead for more than a few years, stepped forward. "You cannot leave," she said, her voice like wind through empty rooms. "The canyon gives sanctuary, but it demands payment. Your lives for your safety." "There has to be another way," Jennifer pleaded. The ghost woman tilted her head, considering. "Perhaps. The shadow folk from the ridge. They cannot enter here, but they will wait. Forever, if necessary. Unless what? Unless you give them what they truly want." She explained that the creatures from Devil's Backbone weren't just hunting us for food or sport. They were ancient beings, older than human civilization, trapped in the desert by forces they couldn't understand. What they wanted was escape, a way to leave their rocky prison and explore the wider world. "They need a vessel," the ghost woman said, "a living host to carry them beyond the boundaries that bind them." I felt sick as I understood the implication. "You want us to let one of them possess us." "One of you," she corrected. "The others could go free." Jennifer grabbed my arm. "No, absolutely not. We'll find another way." But even as she spoke, I could see the logic in the ghost woman's proposal. The alternative was remaining trapped in the canyon forever, slowly starving while our spirits joined the collection of lost souls. "There might be a third option," the ghost woman said suddenly, her attention drawn to Duke. "The animal. It has military training, yes? It has faced death without fear?" Duke looked up at her with intelligent eyes, and I realized she was communicating with him somehow. His tail wagged once, briefly, then he walked over to me and sat at my feet. "No," I said firmly. "Not Duke. I won't sacrifice him." But Duke nudged my hand with his nose, then walked toward the ghost woman with steady steps. He looked back at me once, his eyes full of love and understanding, then continued forward until he stood directly in front of the specter. "He volunteers," the ghost woman said softly. "He understands the choice and accepts it willingly." Jennifer was crying now, but she didn't try to call Duke back. We all understood that this was our only chance. Duke's military training had prepared him for exactly this kind of sacrifice. The ritual began at midnight. The ghost woman led Duke to the center of the clearing while the other spirits formed a circle around them. They began chanting in languages that predated written history, their voices rising and falling in harmonies that made the air itself vibrate. Duke stood calmly in the center of the circle, showing no fear as spectral energy began swirling around him. Gradually, his form became translucent, his essence merging with the ghostly defenders of the canyon. When the transformation was complete, Duke was no longer quite a dog. He retained his basic shape and personality, but now he was something more. A guardian spirit with the power to protect us from supernatural threats. "It is done," the ghost woman announced. "The shadow folk will find no purchase here now. Your protector will stand watch." As if summoned by her words, The creature from Devil's Backbone appeared at the canyon's mouth. But when it tried to enter, Duke's ghostly form materialized between us and the threat. The two supernatural beings faced each other for a long moment. Then the shadow creature slowly backed away. "You're free to leave," the ghost woman told us. "But remember, your protector must remain here. This canyon is his territory now." We said goodbye to Duke, both of us crying as his spectral form nuzzled against us one final time. He had saved us through his sacrifice, but the cost was almost too much to bear. The drive out of Bruha Canyon was surreal. I kept checking the mirrors for signs of pursuit, but the road behind us remained empty. The shadow creature was gone, banished or destroyed by Duke's intervention. We made it home to Austin without further incident, but neither of us was ever the same. The experience had marked us in ways that went beyond the physical. We'd seen things that challenged our understanding of reality, made choices that would haunt us forever. Jennifer and I eventually divorced. Not because we stopped loving each other, but because we could never look at each other without remembering what we'd lost in Bruha Canyon. The guilt of Duke's sacrifice ate at both of us, poisoning our relationship despite our best efforts. I tried getting another dog thinking it might help fill the void, but nothing could replace Duke. No animal would ever again look at me with that combination of loyalty and understanding, that willingness to sacrifice everything for my safety. Sometimes, late at night, I dream about Bruha Canyon. In those dreams, I can see Duke standing guard at the canyon's mouth, his ghostly form keeping watch over other travelers who stumble into that cursed place. He looks happy in these dreams, purposeful in a way he never quite achieved in life. And sometimes, when I'm feeling particularly guilty about his sacrifice, I remember the ghost woman's final words. "Your protector chose his fate. Honor that choice by living well." I'm trying to do that, though it's harder than it sounds. The supernatural world touched us in Bruha Canyon, and once you've seen beyond the veil, you can never quite forget what's lurking in the shadows. But Duke is still protecting us, even in death, and somewhere in the Texas desert, in a canyon where the rules don't apply, my loyal companion stands eternal watch against the things that hunt in the darkness. Some sacrifices echo through eternity. Some love transcends death itself. And some dogs are heroes, even when no one else will ever know their names. I never believed in the stories they told about Lake Wacittita, until what happened to me out there. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 29 years old, and what I lived through during that long weekend still wakes me up at night. The Holiday Rambler Navigator glided down the winding Arkansas highway, the afternoon sun filtering through the pine canopy that stretched endlessly in all directions. My boyfriend Tom gripped the wheel with practiced ease, navigating the curves that led deeper into the Wacittita National Forest. Behind us, our golden retriever Lucy panted contentedly from her spot on the dinette cushions, her tail wagging at the prospect of adventure. According to the GPS, we should reach the campground in about 20 minutes, Tom said, glancing at the dashboard display. Crystal Springs Recreation Area. The website said it's right on the lake. I consulted the brochure we'd picked up at the Hot Springs Visitor Center. Says here Lake Wacittita is the largest lake in Arkansas, 48,000 acres of pristine water surrounded by mountains and forests. Perfect for a long weekend, Tom replied, reaching over to squeeze my hand. No cell service, no internet, no distractions. Just us and nature. Lucy barked her agreement from the back, making both of us laugh. We'd been dating for 2 years, and this trip was supposed to be our chance to reconnect after months of work stress and relationship tension. The remote camping spot on Arkansas's largest lake seemed like exactly what we needed. The forest around us was ancient and dense, towering pines and hardwoods creating a green cathedral that filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns on the asphalt. Occasionally, we'd catch glimpses of blue water through the trees, Lake Wacittita stretching away toward distant mountains, its surface mirror-smooth in the late afternoon calm. "Look at that water," I breathed, pressing my face to the passenger window. "It's so clear you can see the bottom." Tom nodded, though I caught a strange expression crossing his face. "Almost too clear," he murmured, "like it's not quite real." I was about to ask what he meant when we crested a hill and saw the campground spread out below us. Crystal Springs Recreation Area was smaller than I'd expected. Just a dozen RV sites scattered along the lakeshore, connected by a narrow gravel road that wound between towering pines. And it was completely empty. "Where is everyone?" I asked as Tom pulled into the first available site, a prime spot just 50 feet from the water's edge. "Maybe it's the off-season," he suggested, though something in his voice suggested he was as puzzled as I was. Labor Day was 2 weeks ago. Could be all the families have gone home. But as we set up camp, the emptiness felt wrong. The facilities were well maintained, the roads recently graded, the fire pits cleaned and stocked with fresh wood. Everything suggested the campground should have been busy, yet we were the only visitors. Lucy seemed uneasy too. Instead of her usual excited exploration of new territory, she stayed close to the RV, occasionally looking toward the lake with what I could only describe as wariness. When I tried to coax her down to the water's edge, she whined and backed away. "What's wrong with her?" Tom asked, watching our usually fearless dog cower behind the picnic table. "I don't know. She loves water usually." I knelt down and tried to follow Lucy's gaze toward the lake. At first glance, it was beautiful. Crystal clear water stretching away toward forested hills, the surface so still it perfectly reflected the sky. But the longer I stared, the more something bothered me about it. The clarity was unnatural. I could see all the way to the bottom, even in areas that had to be 30 or 40 feet deep. No algae, no fish, no vegetation of any kind disturbed the perfect visibility. It was like looking into distilled water rather than a natural lake. "Have you noticed there are no fish jumping?" Tom observed, joining me at the water's edge. "No insects on the surface, no birds diving for food. It's like the lake is empty." He was right. The water was devoid of the usual signs of aquatic life. No ripples from fish feeding at the surface, no dragonflies skimming across the shallows, no herons stalking through the reeds. The silence was profound and somehow threatening. "Maybe it's just the time of day," I suggested, though I didn't believe it myself. Fish are usually more active at dawn and dusk. We spent the rest of the afternoon setting up camp and exploring the immediate area around our RV. The campground's facilities were modern and well-equipped. Clean restrooms, hot showers, even a small marina with a boat launch. But every single facility was empty, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a ghost town than a recreation area. As evening approached, we cooked dinner on our portable grill while Lucy finally ventured a few feet from the RV to sniff around the edges of our campsite. The temperature dropped rapidly once the sun disappeared behind the mountains, and we were grateful for the RV's heating system. "Listen to that," Tom said as we cleaned up after dinner. I paused, straining my ears. "I don't hear anything." "Exactly. No loons calling, no frogs croaking, no insects chirping. When's the last time you were near a lake this quiet?" The silence was indeed unsettling. Even the wind had died to nothing, leaving the lake's surface like a sheet of black glass that perfectly reflected the stars beginning to appear overhead. The only sound was the gentle lapping of tiny waves against the shore, barely audible and surprisingly rhythmic. "It's probably just the altitude," I said, though I had no idea if that made any sense. Or maybe the water temperature. But as we prepared for bed, the rhythmic lapping began to sound different, more deliberate, more like a pattern than random wave action. I found myself counting the intervals. Lap, lap, pause, lap, lap, pause. Always the same timing, always the same intensity. Lucy refused to settle down for the night. She paced back and forth across the RV's narrow aisle, occasionally stopping to stare out the windows toward the lake. When I tried to coax her onto her usual sleeping spot, she whined and moved away. "She's really spooked," Tom observed, watching our dog's agitated behavior. "Maybe we should have picked a different campground." "It's too late now," I replied. "Besides, it's probably just the new environment. She'll settle down." But even as I said it, I was having my own doubts. The lake felt wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. Too perfect, too empty, too silent. And there was something else, a sensation I couldn't quite name. like being watched by invisible eyes. We went to bed around 10 o'clock, leaving Lucy to her vigil in the main compartment. I expected to fall asleep quickly after the long drive, but instead I lay awake listening to the rhythmic lapping of water against the shore. Lap, lap, pause. Lap, lap, pause. The sound was hypnotic, almost musical in its regularity. But the longer I listened, the more it seemed like something else. Not water against sand, but hands clapping in slow rhythm. Or feet walking on a wooden deck. Or singing. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. Had that been a voice carried on the night air, or just the sound of water transformed by my imagination? Tom was still sleeping beside me, his breathing deep and regular. I slipped out of bed and padded to the bedroom window, peering out at the lake through the thin curtains. The water remained perfectly still, a black mirror reflecting the star-filled sky. But as I watched, I began to see lights beneath the surface. Not reflections of stars, but something else. Pale, bluish glows that seemed to move with purpose through the depths. I rubbed my eyes, certain I was seeing things. But when I looked again, the lights were still there, dozens of them drifting through the water like luminous jellyfish. Some were deep, barely visible in the lake's crystalline depths. Others were closer to the surface, their glow bright enough to cast faint ripples of light on the shore. And they were all moving toward our campsite. "Tom," I whispered, shaking him awake, "you need to see this." He sat up groggily, following my gaze toward the window. "What am I looking at?" "The lights, in the water. Can you see them?" Tom squinted through the curtains, then shook his head. "I don't see anything. Just the lake. But I could see them clearly now. Pale, pulsing lights rising from the depths, some of them breaking the surface and hovering just above the water like will-o'-the-wisps. And with the lights came sound. A low humming that seemed to vibrate through the RV's walls. "You really don't see them?" I asked, my voice tight with growing fear. "Sarah, there's nothing out there. You're probably just tired from the drive." But Lucy could see them too. Our dog was pressed against the main window, her hackles raised and a low growl rumbling in her throat. She stared at the approaching lights with the same intensity she'd shown toward the lake earlier. The humming grew louder, resolving into something that was unmistakably music. Wordless melodies that seemed to come from multiple sources, creating harmonies that were beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The songs were unlike anything I'd ever heard, ancient and alien yet somehow familiar, as if they'd been buried in my genetic memory. "The singing," I whispered. "Please tell me you can hear the singing." Tom listened carefully, his brow furrowed with concentration. "I hear something. Like wind through the trees, maybe?" The lights were at the water's edge now, hovering just above the surface in a rough semicircle around our campsite. In their pale glow, I could see shapes. Not quite human, but close enough to be disturbing. Elongated figures with flowing hair and arms that moved in rhythm with their songs. And they were beautiful. Impossibly, heart-stoppingly beautiful. Each figure was perfect in its own way. Graceful limbs, luminous skin, faces that seemed to shift between different ideals of beauty as I watched. They called to me without words, their songs promising peace and joy and an end to all earthly concerns. I found myself walking toward the door. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Tom's voice sounded distant, unimportant compared to the ethereal music calling from the lake. "They want me to come," I said, my hand reaching for the door handle. "They're so beautiful. They need me." Tom grabbed my arm, but his touch felt like an anchor dragging me down when all I wanted was to fly. The singing creatures were calling my name now, their voices weaving my identity into their wordless songs until I couldn't remember why I'd ever wanted to be anywhere else. "Sarah, snap out of it." Tom shook me hard, and for a moment the spell broke. I blinked, suddenly aware that I'd been about to open the RV door and walk out into the night. What? What was I doing? "You were sleepwalking or something, talking about beautiful creatures in the lake." I looked back toward the window. The lights were still there, but they seemed dimmer now, less compelling, and I could see the figures for what they really were. Not the perfect beauties my mind had created, but something else entirely. They were pale as moonlight, with skin that seemed translucent and eyes that were completely black. Their hair flowed around them like seaweed, and when they opened their mouths to sing, I could see rows of needle-sharp teeth. Beautiful, yes, but in the way that a cobra is beautiful, hypnotic and deadly. Sirens, I breathed, the word coming from somewhere deep in my memory. They're sirens. Tom looked at me with concern. Sarah, you're scaring me. There's nothing out there but an empty lake. But Lucy could see them too, and now she was backing away from the window, whimpering in terror. The creatures had noticed our dog's reaction and seemed to find it amusing. Their songs took on a mocking quality, imitating Lucy's whines and turning them into melody. We have to leave, I said urgently. Right now, before they... The singing stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the music had been. The pale figures in the water remained motionless for a long moment, then slowly began to sink back beneath the surface. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving only the empty lake and the memory of their impossible songs. What just happened? Tom asked, his voice shaky despite his inability to see what I'd seen. I don't know, I admitted, but we're not safe here. Whatever those things were, they were trying to lure me into the water. Things? Sarah, I think you had a nightmare or something. There was nothing out there. I wanted to argue, but how could I convince him when he couldn't see what was right in front of us? Instead, I just nodded and let him think I'd been dreaming. But I remained alert for the rest of the night, watching the lake for any sign of the creature's return. They came back just before dawn. This time, I was ready for them, standing at the window with Lucy pressed against my legs. The lights rose from the depths more slowly than before, as if testing our awareness. When they reached the surface, the singing began again. Softer this time, more subtle in its influence. But I could resist it now that I knew what it was. The melodies were still beautiful, still compelling, but I recognized them as a trap. The creatures in the water were predators, using their songs to lure victims into the lake where they could be... What? Drowned? Devoured? I didn't want to find out. What worried me more was Tom's reaction. He was sleeping deeply, but his breathing had changed, becoming more rhythmic, matching the tempo of the creature's songs. And Lucy, despite her obvious fear, was slowly moving toward the door. The siren's power was growing stronger. I shook Tom awake, but his eyes remained unfocused, dreamy. "Let me sleep," he murmured. "The music is so beautiful. Tom, we have to go. We have to leave right now." But he just smiled and tried to lie back down. The singing was affecting him even though he couldn't consciously hear it, working on some deeper level of his mind. Lucy was at the door now, pawing at the handle and whining. Her fear was warring with the compulsion to obey the creature's call, creating a conflict that was clearly causing her distress. I made a decision that probably saved all our lives. I grabbed the air horn from our emergency kit and blasted it as loud as I could, the harsh sound shattering the night silence and drowning out the sirens' songs. The effect was immediate. Tom jerked awake with full awareness, and Lucy stopped pawing at the door. Outside, the singing stopped abruptly, replaced by sounds of rage and frustration. The pale lights began moving more aggressively, darting back and forth just beneath the surface like angry wasps. "What the hell was that?" Tom demanded, fully alert now. "Emergency signal," I lied. "Thought I heard someone calling for help." But I could see in his eyes that some part of him remembered the music, even if he couldn't consciously acknowledge it. He looked toward the lake with confusion and a longing he couldn't explain. "We're leaving," I announced, starting to pack our gear. "Right now. Sarah, it's 4 a.m. We can't navigate those mountain roads in the dark, and we'll wait in the RV with the engine running and all the lights on until sunrise. But we're not spending another night here." Tom wanted to argue, but something in my tone convinced him not to. We spent the next 2 hours sitting in the driver and passenger seats, the engine idling, the headlights cutting through the darkness toward the lake. The creatures stayed in the water, but I could see them clearly in the headlight beams. Dozens of pale figures swimming back and forth just beneath the surface, their black eyes reflecting our lights like those of nocturnal predators. They knew we were leaving, and they were angry about it. As the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, the sirens began to retreat toward the deeper parts of the lake. They sank slowly, their lights fading as they descended, until only the memory of their songs remained. "Now we go," I said, and Tom put the RV in gear without argument. The drive out of the campground felt like an escape from prison. With every mile we put between ourselves and Lake Wacittita, I felt the weight of the sirens' influence lifting from my mind. But I could tell the experience had affected all of us. Tom kept glancing in the rearview mirror as if expecting pursuit, and Lucy remained agitated long after we'd reached the main highway. "What really happened back there?" Tom asked when we stopped for breakfast in Hot Springs. "And don't tell me it was nothing. Lucy's still spooked, and I keep having memories of the most beautiful music I've ever heard." I told him everything. The lights in the water, the pale figures with their hypnotic songs, the way they'd tried to lure us into the lake. He listened without interruption, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. "Sirens," he said when I finished. "Like in Greek mythology." That's what I thought too. But these weren't mythological. They were real, and they were hunting. Tom was quiet for a long time, processing what I'd told him. Finally, he pulled out his phone and started searching for information about Lake Wacittita. "Look at this," he said, showing me a series of news articles. Unexplained drownings going back decades. Always single victims, always described as experienced swimmers who should have known better. Bodies usually found days later, sometimes miles from where they supposedly went in. I read over his shoulder, my blood growing colder with each article. The victims were always alone when they disappeared, often camping by themselves or separated from their groups. And there was a pattern to the drownings. They clustered around the full moon, when the lake would be brightest at night. Last night was 3 days after the full moon, I realized, and we were completely isolated at that campground. "The perfect hunting conditions," Tom agreed grimly. We drove home in subdued silence, each of us lost in thoughts about what we'd encountered. But it wasn't until weeks later that I discovered the most disturbing detail of our experience. I was going through the photos from our trip when I noticed something in the background of a picture Tom had taken of me setting up camp. In the lake behind me, barely visible in the crystal-clear water, were shapes, human forms lying motionless on the bottom. I enhanced the image on my computer, zooming in until the details became clear. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, scattered across the lake floor like an underwater graveyard. All appeared to be wearing modern clothing, suggesting they were recent victims rather than ancient remains. The sirens of Lake Wacittita weren't just drowning their victims, they were collecting them. I never showed Tom that photograph. The knowledge would have haunted him as much as it haunted me, and there was nothing we could do about it anyway. Who would believe such a story? And even if they did, what authority had jurisdiction over creatures that existed in the gaps between myth and reality? Instead, I did the only thing I could. I researched every missing person case I could find connected to Lake Wacittita and sent anonymous tips to the families, suggesting they might want to search the deeper parts of the lake. Some of the tips led to recovery of remains, giving families closure they'd never expected to find. But the sirens are still there, still hunting, still adding to their underwater collection. The campground remains open. The lake continues to attract visitors, and the drownings continue to happen with clockwork regularity. Tom and I never went RV camping again. The experience had shattered something in both of us. Our trust in the natural world, our belief that beautiful places were inherently safe. We broke up 6 months later, not because we stopped loving each other, but because we couldn't look at each other without remembering that night when we'd almost become part of an underwater museum of the dead. Lucy lived for 3 more years, but she was never the same. She developed an intense fear of any body of water larger than a bathtub and would whimper and hide whenever she heard certain types of music. The veterinarian called it trauma-induced anxiety, but I knew the truth. She'd heard the siren songs and understood their true nature in a way that transcended human comprehension. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I still hear echoes of that hypnotic music. The melodies are fainter now, distant, but they're always there at the edge of my consciousness. And sometimes I find myself planning trips back to Lake Wacittita, imagining how peaceful it would be to slip into that crystal-clear water and join the collection on the bottom. That's when I know the sirens haven't forgotten me either. Their songs may have faded, but the connection remains. A psychic thread that stretches across hundreds of miles, occasionally tugging at my mind when the moon is full and the night is still. I fight it every time, but I can feel my resistance weakening with each passing year, and I know that someday I'll stop fighting. Someday I'll drive back to that empty campground on the shores of Lake Wacittita, and I'll walk into that perfect, clear water, and I'll finally understand what those beautiful creatures were really offering. Peace. Eternal peace beneath the waves, where the music never stops and the pain of the surface world can never reach. Until then, I write down what happened to us, hoping that someone else might read this and choose a different lake for their camping trip. Hoping that our near miss might save others from becoming part of the Sirens collection. But I know that most people won't believe it. The beautiful places of the world keep their secrets well, and the things that hunt in paradise are very good at making their victims disappear without a trace. Just remember, if you ever find yourself camping beside a lake that's too clear, too quiet, too perfect, listen carefully to the night sounds. And if you hear music where there should be only silence, don't walk toward the water. Run. Run as fast and as far as you can, and never look back. Because once the sirens have sung for you, they'll never stop calling your name.